Over the past decade, Denis Villeneuve has shown himself to be one of the next great filmmakers of our time. And with the recent release of Dune Part 2, I thought I would check out his entire filmography, and now I'm going to do a ranking of all of his films from the worst to the best. Hey guys, it's been a while since I released that Dune Part 2 video, and yes, I have seen it again. But I decided I would just move on with this ranking, and you'll get my kind of updated thoughts on that film when I get to its position on the ranking, which, about that, for the sake of this ranking, and I'll kind of explain it later, I'm billing Dune Part 1 and Dune Part 2 as one item, one entry on this list. Before we begin, I've done another one of these director rankings before. I did my first one summer of 2023 when Barbie came out. I ranked all of Greta Gerwig's films. You can check out that video on the channel. It's probably up here as well if you want to click on that. And without further ado, let's get into this ranking. August 32nd on Earth. Denis Villeneuve is a filmmaker that has the rare privilege of having his first film actually be his worst film. I say that that's a privilege because you know that everything that comes after that, it just builds. It just gets better. However, we gotta talk about this film. It's not terrible, it's just odd. It's about this woman who's never found someone to marry and is now asking her best friend to have a child with her. And the film touches on all the awkwardness that goes on in that type of situation and that type of weird concept. This film is kind of experimental, and in that way it's interesting. But it's just an experimental hook. It's not a real hook, because it's kind of interesting, but it's just so weird that I just kind of asked myself why we were here. That being said, it is impressively directed. It is a really good showcase of the directing talent that is Denis Villeneuve. There's a lot of shots that really do stand out whenever the characters get to this huge desert that's just like with white sand. It all looks beautiful. But I would put this film in the category of one of the most beautiful meh films I've ever seen. There's not really a through line between things. It just feels like stuff kind of happening. And just unfortunately, you get some non-believable characters, and that just kind of decreases your sympathy. Just kind of flips genres, it flips tones at random. So just putting that all together, it's not a bad film. It's well constructed enough. Beyond that, I don't think I would ever watch this film again, honestly. Sticking on the category of films I would never watch again, Maelstrom, which is a step above August 32nd on Earth. The weird choices in this film are actually more creative. But despite, again, being well directed, having these interesting pieces in it, it just comes off as pretentious. At times it goes into pretentious directions about the mix of sex and business. There's just too many plot threads in this, like abortion. There's a point where the main character is the cause of a hit and run. There's an aspect to this film of her living up to her mother's legacy. And I mean, it's all interesting ideas, all interesting things to discuss in a film, but they're just all kind of crammed in there, and neither of them really finds its way home. It's a film that is non-linear, but it's kind of just a gimmick. I feel like Denis Villeneuve watched some of Nolan's early work, got really inspired by that, and he did use it better later on. But in here, it doesn't suit the story. There's no purpose. All that being said, again, not a bad film, but just kind of strange. Just kind of this weird thing that is always going to be part of Villeneuve's legacy. Now, as a point of reference, all of the films above these two, I would give thumbs up to. Incendies was Villeneuve's last Canadian film before, like, a stretch of 3 years before he started doing his American films. But a lot of people, when they talk about Incendies, it's really high in their list. I think it's very good. I do have my issues with it, though. I will say it is a very interesting premise. It has a lot of interesting ideas in there of retracing your family heritage, retracing your steps of these. You get these siblings that are retracing the steps of retracing the life of their mother in the Middle East, and especially the second half is a compelling search for answers with truly shocking revelations, a plot twist that, whoa, really caught me off guard, and it was really effective. The film also is trying to balance a bit too much with introducing the mom's storyline and also throwing in like the historical context of this film, what was going on in the Middle East, and all of that. It didn't quite mesh as well as I hoped it would. And the film is kind of this long-winded journey by the time you get to the end. Again, it's not a film that I'm really that eager to rewatch, but I can definitely understand at least most of the praise directed at it. Oh, the misery. Everybody wants to be my enemy. I was very intrigued to check out Enemy, partly because of the differing opinions, because some people view this as a cinematic marvel. Some people don't appreciate kind of the ambiguity. For one thing, it was one of the first A24 films ever made, and then that kicked off one of my favorite studios of all time. And I was actually pleasantly surprised with this one, and I actually really dug it. You have Jake Gyllenhaal, he's a college professor, and one day one of his co-workers tells him about this film that he should rent. He does so, and then he notices that one of the extras in this film is his doppelganger. And this film goes into the awkwardness, the invasiveness, just the strangeness encountering your double. And it does that, and it turns this into what I would extend to say is kind of horror. Because this is an atmospheric experience. There's eerie music. For a film of such a small scale, again, going back to Villeneuve's directing, there are some impressively massive shots of this city. It's a film that's slowly engrossing, builds questions that doesn't really answer, and it has those questions there for you to think about this film, and I was thinking about this film. But given that, the story is simple enough that if you are paying attention to what's going on, you can follow with it. Now, the reason I don't have it a couple of slots higher, even though part of me wants to put it there, is because some of the other films, they do deep explorations of humanity and everything regarding that. It's not as thematically compelling as some of the other films on top of here, but putting that aside, this is a very intriguing, unique film that I will be watching again, and if you haven't seen it, I definitely recommend Enemy. One of the best things that you can say about Sicario is that it has a star-studded cast. I mean, you have the likes of Emily Blunt, Josh Brolin, but when you get to Benicio del Toro, whenever it cuts to him, his character, his storyline, this film just gets even better. The second half of this film has a surprising amount of punch because of that. But besides that, this film has a buildup of intensity through these massive shots and this great score. And Villeneuve knows how to build tension. There's a really great action sequence that takes place in the middle of traffic. One of the best scenes of this film. Just these smoothly directed sequences of people driving as well. And this being a film about cartels, drugs, drug enforcement, it implements that compelling dynamic of doing things all by the books and then using brutality to get results. And when you get to the end of this film, the thing I love the most is that even some of the quote-unquote good guys of this story, they start to seem like villains. Really compelling stuff. I will say, though, this film is mystery, kind of the procedural stuff over the character elements, so whenever you cut back to whatever Emily Blunt's character is doing, which is actually most of the film, It just feels like another one of those gritty action films about the law. But overall, this is just a really solid action thriller. You know, I'm always in the market for a fresh science fiction story, and Arrival checks that box actually. Not only does it have great acting, not only is it visually impressive like all of these films, but it is a different take on the UFO film. Kind of going into how language can define society. And this is a war film, but it's looking at how wars are made on misunderstandings because of language. On top of that, it uses time in a very creative way. I'm not going to spoil it, but I'm a person who also enjoys how the manipulation of time is used inside films. On a thematic level, you have these compelling questions about if you knew how your life would play out, every detail of it, would you still live it? And that is such a deep, thought-provoking question. Again, similar to Sicario, this is one where in the first half-ish of the film, it kind of struggles to set itself up. It takes its time to set all the pieces in motion. I would have liked a bit more with the characters themselves. What this film does thematically, I think it achieves that. But these characters, it took me a while to care about them as well. Maybe on a rewatch that will disappear. But in the end, Arrival is just one of the most unique sci-fi films you'll ever see. At number 4, we have the only of Villeneuve's Canadian films that I can say that I loved. Polytechnique. Based on something that actually happened, where you have this guy that goes to this college with a gun, and he basically kills as many women as he possibly can before shooting himself. And this film touches on something that I always appreciate whenever I'm going through a filmmaker's filmography. It's one of those films that checks the box of excellence through simplicity. Even watching this film, you don't really have characters per se, you have people. And in that, this film captures the emotion of what happened on that day. A film that at times through one character can feel pretty heroic, while also at the same time feeling very tragic, very tense, especially because you have time spent with the killer. But through that, Villeneuve, his directing, elevates all that. Like, this film is powerful. I can't believe that more people aren't talking about this. It's a great example of not having to have a huge story, not having to have the most plot, and also this film is very short, an hour and 10 minutes, but it can still pull off an astounding cinematic experience. Kicking off our top 3, we have Denis Villeneuve's Dune, which includes Part 1 and Part 2. And let me just say, I thought of separating these films throughout the ranking because they would be in different places, but I just thought, why? I mean, they are literally Part 1 and Part 2. They're of one whole. So I'll just kind of like take the average of them and like put them together. Dune is the next great cinematic IP. There's just so much done on both a technical level with capturing Arrakis. And I've seen a video talking about how they had to do the Foley and all the sound effects to have it be as atmospheric as possible. Everything from the costumes to the sets, it's all just mind-blowing. But also you get these great characters that are set up so well in Part 1 and that are taken in very interesting directions in Part 2. Very compelling. A very unique thing that is done with the hero's journey, which again, that was done in the book, but the filmmakers had to put in an effort to get that onto the screen. And hearing how dense the book is, I think Villeneuve did the best job that he could. Again, fantastic cast between these two films, especially in part two, where you get an expansion of this world. More characters, some standouts being Austin Butler and Florence Pugh. You get this deeper exploration of the Fremen society with marvelous action, and part two giving a really good conclusion to this story, to everything that was set up in part one. What I will say, and some issues that kind of put both of these parts out of the top two, maybe even possibly number one, I think that Dune Part 2 is very good. It's not great, at least not at this moment to me. It's a bit overhyped, really. A lot of it has to do with the writing. There are things in this film that I think Villeneuve could have expanded upon. For example, the romance between Paul Atreides and Chani. I thought that was pretty rushed. As a result, it took me 2 times watching this film to realize it, that part 2 is just not, for me, as emotionally resonant as part 1. It's also not paced as well as part 1 is. And I guess I'm in a minority, but I actually prefer part 1 to part 2. Again, that may change later on this year as I let the hype die down when I buy this film on 4K. Honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if Dune Part 2 ends up being in my top 10 films of 2024. I'm not as high on it as everyone else, but combined, both of these films, just epic science fiction, so for that, it still cracks the top 3. Prisoners. Villeneuve's first American film is still one of his very best films to date. Jake Gyllenhaal is this detective assigned to the case of Hugh Jackman's daughter and Hugh Jackman's neighbor's daughter both being kidnapped. The whole film trying to figure out how they disappeared, who took them. And this film introduces something that complements a theme that I like to explore whenever I'm writing my scripts. Usually I like to delve into characters that can be bad, but they have good qualities in them. And this film introduces how, when something bad happens, good people, again, in quotation marks, can become really bad. And I'm not going to go into spoilers, because I feel like a lot of people don't know the certain directions that this film goes in. I know that I didn't know certain directions that the film went in until it was happening, and it was awesome. But this film does explore that compelling side of good versus evil. It does that astoundingly well. Where, of course, you get excellent performances, but for me, Hugh Jackman, I've always loved him, always adored him as Wolverine. But I think this is actually the best performance I've seen from him, period. When you get to Villeneuve and how he shoots this, the visual aesthetics that he decides, the color palette, it harkens back to the gritty crime thrillers like the likes of Seven, or a lot of other things that David Fincher would do, and some other detective films that are escaping my head right now. And I could just tell that Villeneuve, he has an appreciation for this kind of thing. And when he is enhancing this film with his directing, he's not copying from other films. If anything, he's paying homage, and it's all done with love. And it's crazy because as acclaimed as some of his other films have become, especially his sci-fi films, this simple police story remains one of his crowning achievements. As soon as I saw Blade Runner 2049, I just knew that this film had to be number 1 on this list. And that, obviously, is where it stayed. This is such a mesmerizing sequel to Blade Runner. Not just in the visuals, which again, repeating myself over and over with this director, yes, he's figured out how to make a beautiful movie, but seriously, especially with this film, there are some things regarding technology, regarding the replicants, that the VFX that they had, I couldn't comprehend how that came to be. It was unlike anything I had ever seen at some points. Of course, gorgeous cinematography. On top of all that, it's a film that you can have a deeper appreciation of it if you've seen the original, but it really does stand on its own. It takes all the themes that worked about the original, it recontextualizes them, it updates them, and it delivers them in a way that's more accessible. It just lets you sit with all these ideas and uses them to the fullest of their potential. On top of all of that, where you have the likes of Ryan Gosling and Harrison Ford, two actors on the A-list, and then Ana de Armas. Of course, you can never go wrong with her. I absolutely love her. I love seeing her in films, and this is still one of her best roles. So sweet in this film, despite being this hologram character. There's a lot of warmth brought out of her. And touching on how this film concludes, I know that Ridley Scott is thinking about a Blade Runner TV show, Blade Runner 2066 or something. I'm not saying that, this TV show can't do something great on top of that, but if it was just these two films and that was all of the legacy of this story, it ended perfectly. You just can't take your eyes off of everything that's happening because it's so visually marvelous, because the characters are so compelling, because the themes are so rich and important and urgent, and so is the pacing. This is not just one of my favorite science fiction films. This is not just one of my favorite sequels. This is not just one of my favorite detective-esque films, because I do consider Blade Runner to be a detective story. It is now one of my favorite films of all time, so it comes in at number 1. Guys, feel free to leave down your thoughts of these films, your rankings in the comment section below. I'm eager to know what you guys think. Also, I've done other content this year. I've reviewed some other 2024 films, including my review of Dune Part 2. I even reviewed Blade Runner 2049. You guys check that out if you're interested. Make sure to like and subscribe if you like this content. And guys, always, I'll see you next time.